the conversation that we're about to have. I want to thank the Belfast Commemoration Centenary Committee for this being one of 3 series of interviews that deal with Belfast in the 1920 period as we approach those anniversaries. With me this evening is a Belfast historian, writer, community activist, Joe Baker. Joe, thanks for taking time to have this discussion.
No problem, my pleasure.
I grew up like yourself in the north of the city, and I lived with the memories of pogroms in that part of the world. And I know the pogroms were across Belfast, but for the purpose of where we lived. I know some time ago you wrote a very extensive pamphlet on the murders, the McMahon murders, the infamous murders in Belfast. But they weren't the only murders. So can you paint a portrait of Belfast at that period? What would it have been like? What would nationals have experienced?
Well, it goes into the overall part of Irish history, because without getting into great detail, we all know that was the time of partition. Now, whenever partition came along, we have to remember that partition wasn't this, you just went along, drew this line across an island and woke up the next morning and there was 2 different parts of Ireland. It wasn't as simple as that. It was very complicated. And there was a border commission set up, and there was a lot of arguing going on about what was what and who was getting what, what was going to this new free state and what was going to this carcinoria state in the northern part of the country. On top of all that, you had a mass movement of people, and you had people who were unionist within what was going to become the free state, and they were terrified, and of course in the northern part, which was to remain under part of British rule, you had the nationalists who were in great fear of this becoming what was later to be referred to as a Protestant state for Protestant people. And so as the civil war was raging in the new free state between the Republican forces, a civil war was raging also in Belfast. Now, not only Belfast, but throughout what I know as the northern part of the country, but particularly in Belfast, where it was very vicious. And that civil war was basically along sectarian lines. But the death rate was horrendous. But unfortunately today, the only thing that we know, that we remember, is just that the murders that stuck out more. But there was murders happening every day, and that's what we need to remember.
I mentioned the death squads that were operating and as you make the point, in all of Belfast. Who were the death squads? Were they sporadic? Were they organised? Where did they come from?
They were everything. They were, well, I'll give you an example. There was, I'm sure everybody's heard of the infamous character Buck Alec. And Buck Alec was, he was a killer. He just went out and shot Catholics. What appeared to be randomly. But it later came out that Buck Alec was a C special.
And what is that?
It was, well, we had the A specials, you had the B specials, you had the C specials within what was then the RIC. And, they were a sort of like a police unit, that unpaid police unit that was there to assist the regular police. But you had A, B and C. C was basically made up of informers, which Buck Alec was. But, whenever you look at that, well, although he appeared to be random, it later came out that he wasn't as random as what people make out. Then you had organisations such as the Taggers, for example. The Taggers were, the best way to put them in modern terms would be the likes of if you recall the tartan gangs. Yeah. And so you had these small groupings, and the Taggers, Taggers Bay, obviously, one of their most infamous attacks was where they threw a bomb amongst children playing in Weaver Street, killing 6 of them.
Where is Weaver Street?
Weaver Street would have been behind what would end up being the old York Road railway station in the north of the city. So you had these gangs, and you had some that were organised amongst themselves, and some that were directed. And then, of course, on top of that, you had the more sinister elements. The more sinister elements being, you had the special units within the RIC.
And what was the purpose of these special units?
The purpose was to start off, it was to be reprisal. So, not to paint any glamorous picture on it, whenever the IRA killed a police officer, now just a police officer, didn't matter who else, just police, that they were to go out and kill IRA people.
Right.
The problem that they had was that they couldn't get them because the IRA people kept moving about and never stayed in the same house twice, so they couldn't get them. So what they done was the next best thing, and the next best thing, as history has taught us so well, was just to get a Catholic.
And you speak of this as if it was common knowledge of the day, so was there, I know we were familiar with state collusion and killings in the north of Ireland, but was this organised gang within the RIC, the police of the day, did people realise that it was they who were carrying out these attacks, or was it a secret?
Both. And I know that sounds stupid. The people knew it was the police, but people thought it was the B specials.
Okay, right.
Who weren't part of the regular police. And it was only later, well, it wasn't that much later, it was only later that officially that we were informed, but at that time that there was, you have to understand the makeup of the RIC at that time as well, because the RIC was mostly Catholic. And if you look at Belfast, particularly North and West Belfast, where this main particular gang or unit had operated, if you look at the likes of the old Glenravel Street Barracks, it was referred to as the Féin Barracks. And the reason being is because the police within that were very sympathetic to the nationalist cause.
Right.
And what was happening was that whenever you had these gangs, this reprisal unit within the RIC, what they were doing was those police people in that were gathering up affidavits and statements and transferred them to the intelligence unit of Michael Collins, who was still alive at that time. And in turn, they were putting together their own target list, so to speak, to get these people. And they got quite a few of them. And so while the reprisal unit was set up within the RIC to hit IRA people, it turned out actually that the IRA ended up hitting Emmons.
Were they based on, you mentioned Glenravel in the north of the city, been known as the Féin Station or the Féin Barracks. Were these gangs, these organised gangs, did they base themselves out of any particular RIC barracks?
Yeah, two of them. The first one, both of them were in the west of the city, and the first one was at Brown Square Barracks.
Which is the bottom of the Shankill?
Bottom of the Shankill, and the second one, which was on Springfield Road Barracks. Now, they're the two barracks that this unit operated out of. However, it was organised from Musgrave Street Barracks, and although the names of the people who were involved in this unit are well known to us, the people above Emmons were all out of Musgrave Barracks. So in other words, the people that give the orders were from Musgrave Street Barracks, but they didn't get their hands dirty. And we're not talking about your ordinary constable on the beat here. We're talking about the top. The problem that we have today is that all the police records for that period, for that particular barracks, are still closed.
Were you able to conclude if there was an actual leadership of these death squads, these gangs? Were there people whose names you were able to focus in and discover that these were the local leadership of it?
The top man, so to speak, was a Superintendent Gelston, based in Musgrave Barracks. Once again, he was the one who led it, but didn't do any getting the hands dirty stuff. Yeah. Springfield Road was led by County Inspector Harrison, and Brown Square was led by District Inspector Nixon. So once again, I'm pointing out, these were people with titles. Yeah. These weren't your ordinary constable on the beat. These were pretty high up police officers.
You talked about the role that they played in the response on occasions to IRA attacks. Was the purpose to stop the IRA making attacks, or was the purpose to terrorise the Catholic community, or was it a wee bit of both?
You need to look at the wider picture. The wider picture from a sensible point of view is there was basically pogroms going on, because you need to look at what was happening elsewhere. And if you look at places like Banbridge and Damore and Lisburn, where Catholics were being forced out of their homes just for being Catholics, not because they were nationalists or if they were Unionists, simply for being Catholic. So once you have that wider picture, then you need to look at what the theory was behind all this. And the theory would seem to be that for what later came out in the 1930s, only a few years later, was to create this Protestant state. So once the border thing was established and where the border was going to go, the basic background plan would have been, okay, the Free State can be Catholic, this part's going to be Protestant. So they tried to terrorise Catholics to leave. And this is why the theory, once again, is why atrocities such as the McMahon murders was carried out, so that them killings would terrorise people, to fear for their families and to force them out.
I want to return to the McMahon, but I'm very interested in your interpretation of that period of history. You would be forgiven for believing that there was no rhyme, purpose or reason, that these almost were sporadic attacks. Now, while you're acknowledging there was an element of that by other groups, gangs effectively, there also was appears to be, a state plan, and that plan was a quite sophisticated plan. So on one hand, you had the pogroms, and I'm assuming those pogroms, and you mentioned Lisburn and Dromore and that part of the world, were these large scale, were these hundreds of families affected, or dozens? Or?
No, they were large scale for the sizes of the place.
Yeah.
You have to remember that these places weren't as big as what they are today.
Sure. Yeah.
So it didn't matter if it was 100 or 2. If it had been 5, it was still having that impact.
Yeah.
It was still having the impact that what they wanted. And whenever you look at, if we ignore the gangs, so to speak, the sporadic gangs, whenever you look at the likes of the RIC one, which was known as the Cromwell Club, all you have to do is look at the name.
Oliver Cromwell?
And the significance of that name, Cromwell, and the Catholic connection. That's all you have to look at. However, whenever you dig a bit deeper, and that whether you love or loathe them, whenever you look at Michael Collins was a very intelligent man, and he ran a very tight intelligence unit, and all these statements and reports were all going to him. And whenever we learn about the setup of this Cromwell Club, as I said, it was run from Musgrave Street Barracks. A lot of people don't realise this at the time, but the old town hall is next door, and the old town hall was connected to Musgrave Street Barracks. The old town hall was the headquarters of the Unionist Party. So you look at it and you go, hold on, what's going on here? What's happening? So if you want whenever you look at the whole sort of links, all the links all connect down to this one place, which is Musgrave Street Barracks, and its next door neighbour, the Unionist Party, which is where it was all organised from. And then whenever you look at, someone will talk about later, District Inspector Nixon, and about what he went on to become, and the Unionist power behind him, then you can see where it's all linked.
These attacks were fairly widespread, and you mentioned Arnon Street, I think you said earlier on. You mentioned other attacks that had taken place. Was there any one part of Belfast, any one part of nationalist Belfast that was more subjected to these attacks than others?
Well, the short answer is no. It was, if you look at the likes of Brown Square Barracks, the area around, the nationalist areas around Brown Square Barracks, such as Carrickhill and Millfield, they got a horrible time. Whenever you look at the areas around Springfield Road Barracks, they got a horrible time. But if you look at the likes of, and this goes back to what we're talking about the theory of the pogrom of forcing everybody out. A lot of killings that were carried out about these gangs too were very horrific in their manner. on a few occasions, the gangs burst into the homes and went upstairs and broke the legs of the husbands and then set fire to the house, knowing that they couldn't get out because their legs were broke. What was the point of doing that? You know, why would you even think of doing it? But the whole idea was this terror, to create this absolute terror so that people would flee. And a lot of people did flee. And it seems to be, whenever you look at what they were doing and look at what the Cromwell Club were doing, and whenever you're seeing what the overall aim is, it would be very foolish to assume that they weren't linked.
It kind of really strikes me as you speak that this was really a forerunner to the Shangle Butchers. That this was about sheer terror, about intimidating the entire Catholic community rather than a war directed against the IRA.
Yeah. If you look at the Cromwell Club, and I remember, we'll keep going back, this was a police unit. And, you know, one of their most infamous murders was what became known as the halfpenny killings. The halfpenny campaign, Mulcahy, halfpenny, William Kerr, etc. And what had happened there was these people weren't simply shot. This police unit went to their homes, each home, abducted all three of them, took them away and tortured them to death, and just left them because they knew there was a curfew on. And because there was a curfew on, nobody could come out. And because there was a curfew on, nobody could come out to help them when they heard their screams and cries. So the whole idea was terror. These people just had free range throughout the whole areas. And the only thing that gave them away at times was their Crossley tenders because of the noise. And, you know, and on one of their murders, you know, we've heard about I've mentioned the halfpenny and the Dublin Bullers and stuff like that. And then, you know, one of the interesting giveaways was that in one of the murders which they committed from Springfield Road Barracks, they went in, done their murders, and left their dog behind by accident. And what happened was that people figured, let the dog go and see where it goes. And the dog went out, and they followed the dog, and the dog went straight to Springfield Road Barracks. So they didn't care about people knowing that they were doing it. They had nothing to worry about because nobody was going to prosecute them.
Catholic society, I mean, for instance, the Catholic press, I mean by that the Irish News and the Catholic Church, what was their response to it? Were they as adamant, or did they have the knowledge that you obviously have about who these people were, and were they raising that as an issue?
They weren't raising it. Your moderate nationalist MPs, well, Joe Devlin, etc. And Joe Devlin was a personal friend of the McMahons, you know, and he had raised it in Parliament, British Parliament, but it was just ignored. You know, it was just in terms of Britain didn't care. You know, as far as they were concerned, the parties could wipe each other out. But it wasn't officially pursued as it should have been. However, in the background, there was stuff going on. And to give you an example, the likes of the affidavits that were gathered from the RSC members past to Michael Collins were being collected by a priest in St Patrick's Church. You know, so in the background stuff was going on. But, you know, in terms of cardinals and bishops, silence was deafening.
Better be quiet than cause trouble. You mentioned that I have mentioned the McMahon killings. I want to touch on it. This is a pamphlet, and I know there's an updated version of it. Is it possible to get the updated version, or is it out of print as well?
Well, it's out of print, but just to do a quick plug, if anybody goes to the Belfast History Project website, you can download it completely free of charge.
I actually think, in the context of this discussion and the other interviews that we'll be carrying out, it's important that people have a sense of this. And the McMahon murders probably are the most known of the killings that took place during that period. So, if you don't mind, who were the McMahons?
Right, the McMahons, well, the head of the household was Owen McMahon, and Owen McMahon was a very prominent businessman, Catholic businessman in Belfast at the time. And he owned, his family owned a lot of public houses. The family owned the public houses right up until the 70s, believe it or not. And but for Mr. McMahon himself, he was the owner of the Capstan Bar, which I'm sure a lot of us will remember was in Ann Street, only closed down recently. And on top of that, he was also the chairman of Glentoran Football Club. So, he was just a regular businessman. Now, he wasn't wealthy, but he was comfortable, he was well off. And he and his family lived in Kinnaird Terrace, which is just off Thorndale Avenue on the Antrim Road. Now, the area has changed since, but at that time, that was a very affluent Protestant area.
Really?
So you needed to be well off to live there. And on top of that, his house was on a private street overlooking private gardens. So we're not talking about some backstreet kid here. We're talking about a very, very prominent family. And whenever the unfortunate murders occurred, one of the biggest mysteries was, why did they target the McMahon family? There was no rationale behind it. There was no...
And by that, I take it that what you mean is they weren't a prominent Republican family.
No, they were far from... They were a prominent Catholic family. They were far from Republican. They were personal friends of Joe Devlin, and Joe Devlin being a nationalist MP, but nationalist with a small n. These people were basically pro-union. But the McMahon thing wasn't a random attack. It was very, very well organised. And because it wasn't random, it begs the question, why would they target it? And that's a mystery, unfortunately. I don't think we're ever going to know.
Do you have an opinion?
The opinion is that to go with the pogrom to terrorise a Catholic community out of the north.
Take us through the actual attack, and maybe that'll explain why it was so early.
Well, as it says, they lived in Kinnaird Terrace, which was a private street just off Thorndale Avenue, and it was carried out by the Cromwell Club, it was carried out by the RIC reprisal unit. And basically what they had done was they had gathered together, they had obviously planned this, they had gathered together in 2 Crosley tenders. Now remember what it says earlier, Crosley tenders were very noisy, and the streets then were cobblestoned, so nothing was going to go quietly. So they even took that into account. So what they done on this occasion was they left on 23rd of March 1922, they left Brown Square Barracks at around midnight. They then drove to Carlisle Circus, where there was work being done on the road, and went to the watchman and removed the sledgehammer, took a sledgehammer off him. They then drove up the Crumlin Road and along Clifton Park Avenue and parked up at Clifton Park Avenue. Now, I know there's a lot of viewers who are going to be unfamiliar with the area, but whenever I mentioned that they lived at Kinnaird Terrace and there was private gardens facing their house, Clifton Park Avenue was at the other end of these private gardens, so they knew to park the Crosley tenders at the other end. So what they then done was cross the park, used the sledgehammer, smashed down the McMahon family home door, and then they gathered up. Now you have to remember there was no electricity at the time, so it wasn't exactly as if the lights were switched on, so it was all gas light damage. So the thing was in darkness, poor light, and they gathered all the family. And what they then done was they got the mother and her niece, the female members of the house, and locked them in a back room. They then proceeded to gather every male in the home.
Which was how many?
Well, there was Owen McMahon, 6 sons and his barman, Edward McKinney. They got all the males and put them into the front room parlour. Now you have to understand what was going through the McMahons at the time. They just presumed it was a police raid. And one of the survivors, John McMahon, later turned around and talked about they were baffled why the police were raiding their home. There was no reason. And and at the saying that he points out, what must have been a real terrifying moment, because what you had what they just assumed was police on a police raid, and then one of the leader of this unit, who we now know as District Inspector Nixon, just turned around and saying, "You boys better now say your prayers," and then gunned them down. So you need to understand the impact that would have had, and that's exactly what they done. They just gunned them down. One of them, one of the younger ones was able to, one of the children was able to dive under a table, and, this silly theory came out because he was that young and let him go. No, they did not. They shot after him. The thing that saved him was the table. And, basically they gunned down Owen McMahon, 4 of his sons, and the barman, Edward McKinney, and then about 2 weeks later, another son he died. Bernard McMahon had died, leaving only John McMahon to be the sole survivor. So
all this was witnessed in a room above the murder scene by the wife, the niece,
and then of course the survivor.
And the survivor.
And one of the things that I always talk about on about this is that everybody that night lost their lives. Because for Mrs. McMahon, for her niece and for John, their life was ruined. And we need to try and get an understanding of just how horrible that must have been.
The McMahon killing, because of the sheer number of those who were assassinated, those who were murdered, what impact did it have on the Catholic community? Did it terrorism? Did it?
Yeah. I know this sounds horrible, but all the killings before that were in working class areas.
Yeah.
And in general, people didn't care. And I was saying, I know what, of course the people that lived there cared, but in society as a whole,
it didn't have great impact.
Didn't have an impact and thing, but the impact of the McMahon murders wasn't only local, wasn't only national, it was worldwide. And the world's press was now focused on this. Now, at this time, the people responsible, this Cromwell Club, led by District Inspector Nixon, they went too far. And at this time, the RIC and the Border Commission was all being sorted out. The RIC was now slowly turning into the RUC. And whenever the RUC was being formed, they all had to go. Every single one of them had to go. And the McMahons was the nail in the coffin for it.
So did Catholic Belfast, was there a mass funeral? Was there a joint funeral for the McMahon family? Did Belfast, or did Catholic Belfast come to a standstill? You mentioned international focus on the killing. How did it react?
Well, first of all, the reaction was just shock and horror. The McMahon murder, they were all buried together and in Milltown Cemetery, and they were buried from St Patrick's in Donegal Street. A massive service attended by all the high and mighty of the Catholic Church, and Joe Devlin, who, as I pointed out, was a personal friend of Owen McMahon. And one of the unique things about the McMahon funeral, and I know it's only a small detail, but people sometimes don't pick up on these small details. Both of us being from the New Lodge, both of us will know that whenever a funeral leaves St Patrick's, it goes along Carrickhill and along Millfield. Yeah. The McMahon murder, or the McMahon murder victims, their funeral went down on along Royal Avenue, which was the main thoroughfare of the city. And the reason for that was because of the standing Owen McMahon had within the community, but not only the Catholic community, the Protestant community as well. And you'll heard me mention it earlier on, he was, for example, chairman of Glentoran Football Club. And, there's not too many supporters of Glentoran knocking about the Falls Road, if you know what I mean. Yeah. So he was well respected from both sides, and the reckoning is that it was brought down through the centre of the city to allow the both sides to pay their respects. And that's just a small detail that people would fail to notice. But once again, it signifies the type of family they were, and why this planning went into just identifying them as a target.
You mentioned that the McMahon murders were a murder too far, almost, that this Cromwell gang group, club, that it had, even by the standards of the brutal nature of what had happened prior to that, in terms of the killings of Catholics, that they had gone too far. The RUC were about to take over from the RIC, although many of the people were the same people, different titles and all of that. So I'm assuming you're going to tell me that Nixon was got rid of and never was heard of again. Is that what you were going
That would be brilliant to think, but unfortunately, no. To cut a long story short, it wasn't because of the McMahon murders that caused the outrage. It was because of who the McMahons were.
Sure.
You know, if they had been, on Fallswater Street, nobody would have batted an eyelid. You know, it was because of who they were. And, Nixon, particularly Nixon, was getting out of control. And, which we'll talk about later on, some of his gang were targeted by the IRA, and he knew that the IRA were coming for him. He knew he was their number one target. And we'll talk about that later as well. But basically, what happened with Nixon was that Nixon had kept a record of everything that he was involved in and who had ordered it and who was behind it. And it became known, I know it's a bit of a cliche these days, but it became known as the Black Book. And that's what saved Nixon, because he knew too much. So whenever the RIC or the RUC were formed, he was expecting to be appointed district or county inspector, with Harrison promoted to city commissioner. Now, Harrison and co, they all got their promotions. Nixon didn't get any promotion whatsoever, and that was a real bitter blow to him. And he realised then that his days within the police force were numbered.
And so, what did he do? Where did he go? What happened?
Well, to give the background as to who he was, Nixon was he was born in County Cavan in 1800, joined the police 1899, so he was just a typical Victorian policeman. Whenever the 1916 rebellion broke out in Dublin, he was very active there. He's very, very anti-Republican. Very anti-Republican. And then later on, as things progressed there, he led a detachment of the Black and Tans, the irregulars, and I don't think you need me to tell you too much about who they were. After that, of course, he was moved to Belfast, just regular policeman, a couple of promotions, sergeant, head constable, and then he was made a district inspector, district being what is out of the area around Brown Square. Then come our trouble, the Cromwell Club is established. He was very prominent in that. The McMahon murders, the Arnott Street massacre, the Malky Halfpenny killings, the Dufferin Brother murders, done it all. And then afterwards, whenever things settled down, for the want of a better word, he realised his days within the police force were numbered, and then he started to sort of loosely get involved in politics, and he started to give a couple of fiery speeches at Clifton Street Orange Hall.
For any particular party?
No, just hatred of nationalism and anything to do with nationalists. So I'm sure we've all heard the saying, not an inch, and a lot of us refer that to Ian Paisley. No, the person who said not an inch was Nixon at a speech in Clifton Street Orange Hall about the Border Commission. Now remember that there was no border set up at this stage. This was all still being worked out, and he was upset that his beloved Kevin was now going to go into the Free State, so that's where he got that from. And so then he realised the support he was getting, and he was pulled in by his superiors within the RIC about this speech that he had given.
Sorry, was this speech while he was serving in the RIC?
Yep. And he was pulled in about this speech, and this is how I know he was being set up for dismissal. Whenever he was pulled in, he was only allowed to answer yes or no. He wasn't allowed to give any descriptions or any explanation. It was just yes or no. And he realised that was it. He was out. He was out of the place. So then he turned to politics, because he had the support of the entire B Specials behind him during all this, and a lot of the what was now the RUC. And cut a long story short, got into politics as an independent unionist. He would never join the Unionist Party, but he was offered to join the Unionist Party. So they offered to let him in. But he stood as an independent and first of all became a city councillor with what was then Belfast Corporation, now Belfast City Council. And then they stood for the elections as an MP for Woodville, and he won, and he held on to that seat for the rest of his life until he died in 1849. But the thing about it was what we're familiar with that firebrand unionism today.
Yeah.
He was the first. He was the real.
I want to move, you mentioned on a number of occasions other members, harassment and so on, and people. I want to touch on we're almost completely finished with the interview, but I want to ask you just two questions. As he was standing for election, and as he was successful, was his reputation known? Did people know that he had been part of a death squad?
The reputation was a success. Everybody knew.
He got elected because of his reputation.
Yeah, everybody knew who he was. Everybody knew exactly what he'd done, and that's why. You know, this was the open secret. You know, it wasn't all out officially, but everybody knew. You know, and people have argued with me before. They've turned around and says that you know, we'll have to remember that Nixon was never charged with any of this, and that's 100% true. The only thing that saved him from being charged is he was on the right side of the border. If he had stayed in County Cavan, he would have stood trial. Now, whenever I say he's elected, I'm not talking about he won by 3% of the vote. I'm talking about sometimes it was unanimous that he was getting in.
In the last few minutes that we have, the other members, the other prominent members of the gang, what became of them?
For the prominent members, they were all promoted. And because what had happened was that the people like Harrison's and the head constable gifts and stuff like that, they all accepted this new police force, the new police force being the RUC. They accepted this is the way things were going. The Border Commission had settled on 6 counties of the northern part of the country. But, well, as we know now, the original idea was Ulster, the province of Ulster. And 3 counties were cut off, which included Nixon's county of County Cavan, and because we knew it would give a Catholic majority of the had of. But they all thing. But remember what it says also, that these people were high in the IRA target list, and before the Collins-Craig Pact, the couple of them were assassinated. For example, the one of them, Christy Clark, and this is a remarkable thing about this Cromwell Club. Christy Clark was murdered on the Falls Road at Mulholland. Assassinated on the Falls Road at Mulholland Terrace, and he was a Catholic and buried in Milltown. And the remarkable thing is that when you're looking at Clark's grave in Milltown, if you look behind it, you see the McMahon plot.
So close.
You know, and that's the thing that always got me. Why were these people in this unit? You know, when the name alone would suggest that it's anti-Catholic. And to go back onto our Nixon, particularly during the Collins-Craig Pact, which was basically not to attack each other. And the interesting thing was that Nixon was almost not included in that, because obviously it had been made clear to the new Northern government that Nixon was going to be got, but they knew they couldn't get Nixon while he was still in this new province, so to speak.
Yeah.
And obviously there was an underhand agreement that, listen, if you get him outside it, that's fair game.
Yeah.
And he never left, never. But they offered him a commission with the Canadian police force before he was dismissed. And the interesting thing was he offered that commission
To get him out of the road.
to get him out of the road and to allow the IRA to assassinate him.
At some stage, those pogroms settled. So when was that? Was that in 22 or 23? When did the killings, if you like, stop for that?
Well, it stopped mid-1922, and that's when things began to settle down. But as I mentioned earlier, there was an awful lot of anarchy at the time, because who was the government? And For a period of time, a period of 6 weeks, people don't realise that, the whole of Ireland was under Free State control for a period. People forget all that. But it settled down. I would say the McMahon murders would have been one of the pinnacles of that whole killing spree, and it had that massive impact, and then the killings began to die away, and then by mid 1922, that was things were over, and it basically began to settle down from them.
I'm going to put you on the spot, which I'm glad to do. You talked about the black book that had the details of the killings, and even perhaps the names of the planners of the killings. If you were to speculate, and I know you don't do it, but for the purpose of the interview, are we talking about senior so-called police officers? Are we talking about senior politicians? Are we talking about who, in your opinion, give cover to these killings?
We're talking about them all. And
so effectively state collusion.
Yeah, it's now known as state collusion, but the thing about it was that within the police force, they naturally had the protection of all their superior officers. Now, remember the titles we're talking here. We're talking about, city commissioners. We're talking about, district inspectors. We're talking about county inspectors. These are all very senior people. On top of that, then, if they're protecting the people, from head constable downwards, then who's protecting them? And it's obviously that, although there was no Northern government at the time, remember what it says earlier. The headquarters of the Unionist Party were connected to Musgrave Street Barracks, and Musgrave Street Barracks is where these were all led from. The orders were given from Musgrave Street Barracks. So there's obviously that connection. On a bigger scale, if they're protecting the senior police officers of what later became the Northern government, then who's protecting the Northern government?
Yeah.
And it's obviously the British government.
It all sounds very familiar. I want you to plug your pamphlets and booklets again. And the reason I want you to do that, if you don't mind, is because the whole purpose of these discussions that we've been having over this next week is to educate and to inform, and lots of the information that you give, I didn't know until you spoke about it. Lots of it is new to, I assume, a whole lot of people. So where can we find the information that you have collated and put together? Right,
if you go to the website Belfast History Project, and you'll see a link books. Just click on books and you'll see the McMahon family murders. And although the title would suggest it's all about the McMahon family murders, it's not. It's the McMahon family murders is used as the base of the story of that period. And in that, you'll be told about the McMahon family murders, obviously. You'll be told about Mr. Nixon, Mr. Harrison, all of them, the whole Cromwell murder gang. You'll be told about everybody who was killed in that period. You'll be told about the Arnon Street massacre. You'll be told about the Malachy Halfpenny murders, the Devlin brother murder. You'll be told all of it. And, if anybody wants to gauge an opinion on it, read that first and see how brutal that period was and see who was behind half of these killings. And you can be apolitical. Doesn't matter what your politics are, it doesn't matter what your belief, it doesn't matter what your religion are. It'll point out just how horrific this period was. And for me, the true horror is not the horrors that were committed, but the horror of who was behind it. On those very poignant words, I want to thank you for taking time out to have this discussion. It's been a fascinating discussion, Joe. It's been an informative discussion. So for all of that, thank you. You're welcome.